Hello, thanks for being in a new video. This time I have a full review of the 13-inch MacBook Air with M3 processor. Let's get started. Let me remind you that this computer is available in both 13-inch and 15-inch sizes. And in virtually every respect, it is the same as the M-Deuce model. So I recommend you go check out my review of the 15-inch MacBook Air with M-Deuce because they will share a lot of things. And in that video, I also mentioned the differences of the 15-inch model to the 13-inch model, which remain the same in this generation. So the basic difference will be the processor. And if you were to ask me, I should tell you that I would recommend you more to buy the version with M-Deuce because there really is not such a big evolution from the last generation to this one, unless for you it is an indispensable priority to have ray tracing on the processor. But today there are not so many games that support ray tracing, so it ends up being a feature that is very important, but that you will not take advantage of so much. That's why I would recommend you to buy the last version. And if we get picky, I even think that with the MacBook Air with M1 processor, you would have more than enough to work with in many aspects, and you would save a lot of money. So the MacBook Air with M1 processor is still recommended today, even though there is already a version with M3. In its most basic model, with 256 gigabytes of storage, it is priced at 22,999 pesos. On the screen, you see the reference price in dollars to give you an idea, but remember that the prices here are not the same as over there. Obviously, there will be more storage versions available, which in fact I consider necessary because 256 gigabytes may not be enough for a large number of users. If you are only going to handle Word or Excel type documents, maybe it will be enough for you, but if you are going to handle more things, it will fill up very quickly and you will depend on the iCloud cloud storage that is paid separately. That's why I recommend you look for older generations so you can buy the versions with more storage, because Apple usually offers you 256 in the most basic model that I personally consider very little space. Believe me that at this price, if you look for computers from other brands, you are going to find much more storage capacity. But if you insist that you want a Mac, what I would recommend would be to look for older generations. So as I say, the design, the screen, the sound, the software, the security, everything is absolutely the same as the last generation, although obviously today the Mac operating system is already upgraded, so you can have more features, but the older models still get the upgrade. So there is nothing to worry about. For example, you could use the iPhone directly from the Mac screen, although that feature was announced in a very attractive way, and I personally consider that there are still several aspects where it could be improved. It is not so easy to drag and drop content from any application to another, so there is still a long process of optimization in this novelty that is one of the main features of the operating system, but I insist, it is also available in past versions. Although the only change has been the processor, the battery could also be affected because it is a new generation of processor. So let me tell you the data I have regarding the battery life of this model. Although unfortunately I wasn't able to test the 13-inch model with the M2 processor, but I tested the 15 model, so it's bigger and therefore has more battery, but that's my reference. So trying to drain the battery with extreme processor consumption, it gave me about 3 hours and 36 minutes, which is about 40 minutes less than the last version, but the large size of the last version. That's why I tell you it's a little weird to make this comparison. I think it's normal that it lasts less, obviously, than a bigger model that has a bigger battery. But the curious thing comes when I did a test simply playing YouTube videos with 50% brightness and volume. And in this case, it reached more or less about 10 continuous hours playing this video. That's 30 minutes longer than the 15-inch MacBook Air with M2. So you notice that in this scenario, it did manage to have a battery that even lasted longer than the last generation in the larger size. What does this mean? That the new processor will indeed be more efficient in basic tasks. Possibly if you have very demanding tasks, it will be exhausted. But even so, the battery of today's MacBooks is always outstanding. There are few computers that can compete today with the autonomy offered by the Mac, at least among those I have tested. The detail here is that the box includes a very weak charger of only 30 watts in this 13-inch version. On the 15-inch version, the charger is 35 watts with 2 USB-C ports, which is still underpowered because the Mac actually supports 70 watts of charging. But you know, Apple loves to sell you the charger separately, even though they do include a charger here, but it's very underpowered even though it's compact and convenient. convenient to carry, so that could be a justification, but it's a charger that's not going to give us an exaggeratedly fast charge or anything like that. In 15 minutes, it recovered just 9% of this computer's power, and yes, there is a noticeable difference from the 15% that the 15-inch M2 processor MacBook Air recovered. In 30 minutes, it got up to 21%, nothing more, and the full charge finished in 2 hours and 38 minutes. Although as of 2 hours and 10 minutes, it was already at 94%. So, the final phase of charging is very slow, and still Mac doesn't have some software options that allow you to have a charge lock or disable smart charging or something similar. So there are still a number of things to improve over other computers. But what is certain is that it's going to offer us good battery life in conjunction with a fairly thin and relatively light body. Let me do an application opening test, in this case including Microsoft applications. While I tell you that the device comes with the Apple M3 processor, which will be the difference from the last generation. It is a slightly more powerful processor, especially in CPU, but the difference is really very little in terms of the increase in power. The biggest difference we'll see in gaming, where I'll tell you another important fact. Remember that it comes with 8-core or 10-core GPU options, but obviously the 10-core version is more expensive. And as you can see, it took 2.8 seconds on average, which is a very significant improvement over last generation. But I think that's mostly due to the further optimization of the Microsoft applications, which in the last generation had taken much longer to open. But even using Microsoft apps, it took less time than last generation opening Apple apps. Obviously, this also has to do with the operating system that has been more optimized today. So possibly if I test again with the last generation, but with the updated operating system, we will also see an improvement. But the truth of the matter is that it is a very fast computer when handling various applications. If, for example, we're going to open multiple tabs within Safari as well, and in this case it has 8 GB of RAM, but that can be more than enough for a very good amount of users, since Apple manages its RAM memory in a very good way. Notice that all these tabs are open. While we also have the App Store, we are also going to open a Word document, while we also open an Excel document, and finally also a PowerPoint document. Remember that Telegram is also open. In Photoshop, we're also going to open up some image, and in this case, it's a high-resolution photograph. And notice that it already shows me that the virtual memory disks are full. So the RAM memory, if it could prove to be short, if you're a very demanding user in terms of the things that you have open. Let's say it has a limit, but at least it does maintain a smooth experience when you have all this stuff full. So let's close some apps so we can edit a photograph. Although I remind you, it was a high-resolution photograph and maybe that complicated the situation. But overall, I think the computer is powerful. But even though I've closed absolutely everything, you can see that it still comes up with this error. And this is where you notice that we find little internal storage on this computer. So I'm going to have to uninstall one of the games I tried in order to be able to run other applications. And finally, I was able to open the picture. Good thing that happened, so that you can see that if you have a lot of files, it could stop some of the computer from working because of the little space it has. But now that we have Photoshop open with a high-resolution photograph, let me select the object selection tool so you can see how fast it can respond. And the truth is that it was very good to do all this analysis. In general, as I tell you, it responds quite well. But the limitations of RAM or storage could complicate the life of more than one. Here I have Adobe Lightroom as well, and obviously in this sense is going to have a good performance. Although, as I say, if you need to have an important margin in the storage to be able to have the virtual memory available for these applications. In the test of exporting video with Adobe Premiere, we have 4 clips recorded in 4K. These are exactly the same clips that we use in all the computer reviews. So we do the test of exporting this video in 4K and see how long it takes, which in this case was about 34 seconds or so using the default Adobe Premiere settings. Then I also wanted to do the same test, but now with Final Cut, which is an Apple program. And the truth is that it took exactly the same time with this same HD .264 setting, which is one of the more traditional formats. However, I repeated the test, but now using Apple codecs, and curiously, it took exactly the same time again, approximately 34 or 33 seconds. So it is a machine that while it can offer us a good speed, overall it is not ultra fast. And remember that this same performance remains very similar whether it's plugged in or unplugged. If what interests you most are the benchmarks in Cinebench, I managed to get 9,263 points in multi-core and 1,898 points in single-core, although this will obviously vary run after run. But in general, we can say that it is a more powerful computer than the last generation without too much difference. In NovaBench, for example, we also had 1,069 CPU points, while last generation had obtained 934. So yes, there is an evolution, but I insist that it's not that big. And interestingly, in GPU, I actually had less performance than last generation. Although I remind you that last generation I tested it in its 15-inch size, so it probably had more room for cooling. Lastly, I tested some games First X with 2. The truth is, it's a simple game. Remember that one thing you're going to notice about Apple is that their catalog of games is still very small, so little by little more developers are coming on board to port their games for Mac. But the catalog is very short compared to what we see on Windows. So this game honestly ran pretty well. There wasn't much to demand from it. Then I played some Disney content, and in this case it did hit 60 frames per second. The average was pretty much 59. There was very little jitter, it almost always stayed at 60 and the temperature didn't get too high either. Overall, the performance was good, although I insist that it is not such a complicated game either. Then I played Stray, which is a cat game. In this case, I must say that if you set the quality higher than the default setting, you will notice that it runs a little more crazy and with some freezing. But if you use the default settings, if you go to 60 frames per second, it had just a very small low peak, but overall it does look very advanced. There are good effects, good reflections. In this case, it is a game that apparently does use ray tracing, and the truth is that it also controls its temperature very well without exceeding 41 degrees Celsius, which on a laptop is quite cool. Finally, I also tried Resident Evil, and in this case the experience was very good, although all the time it was limited to 30 frames per second. It doesn't go beyond that, but it looks like that will be the setting, as this game was actually uncomplicated for the Mac because the temperature was 33.5 degrees Celsius, so it achieved a very smooth run. And remember that even if it's unplugged from the power, the performance is still going to be the same, so it performs very well. The only detail is that currently the catalog of games on Mac is quite short. That's why I insist that this computer is not worth buying yet, because its differentiation with respect to the last generation is to support ray tracing, which is a feature that the most advanced games of the moment have, but for now there are very few games on Mac that support this feature. For the moment, we have reached the end of this video. If you liked it, you know you can tell us about it, and we'll see you next time.